In a cemetery on the coast of Tunisia, in the ruins of a city that Rome tore down to the foundations, archaeologists opened graves that had been sealed for more than 2,000 years. The people inside them spoke a language from the far eastern end of the Mediterranean. They wrote it in an alphabet from the far eastern end of the Mediterranean. They worshipped gods whose names had been carried west from a narrow strip of coast in what is now Lebanon. In 2025, a research team sequenced their genomes, along with 200 more individuals from 13 other sites scattered across the same sea. Almost none of them had an ancestor from that coast. For 2,000 years, we have described these people using a word invented by their enemies, and the word carried an assumption that nobody ever went back and tested. The assumption was that a shared culture meant shared blood. Begin with a snail, because the snail is where the money came from. The murex is a spiny sea snail, unremarkable to look at, common along the eastern Mediterranean shore. Inside it is a small gland containing a clear fluid that turns, on exposure to air and sunlight, into a dye ranging from the deepest purple through to a bright, almost shocking pink. The extraction is slow, it is filthy, and the yield from a single animal is minute. The processing sites stank badly enough that they were kept downwind of the cities that owned them. What came out the other end was the single most expensive textile product in the ancient world. It did not fade with washing or sunlight, which almost no ancient dye could claim, and it was controlled almost entirely by one narrow strip of coastline. Purple became the color of rank across the Mediterranean because one group of cities held a near monopoly on producing it, and everyone else had to buy. Now look at the strip itself, because it is not an obvious place to build anything. It is a band of shore running along what is now Lebanon and northern Israel, pinned between mountains and open water. There is very little farmland. There is no workable metal. There is no grain surplus, and there is no plain wide enough to raise and feed a large army on. By the standards of the Bronze Age, this is marginal ground. It had two assets: snails and trees. The cedar forests running down those hills produced timber tall enough and wide enough for shipbuilding in a region where the two great powers, Egypt to the south and Mesopotamia to the east, had almost nothing usable. That single fact made these cities necessary to everybody, and it is the reason they show up in Egyptian records centuries before anyone thought of them as a civilization in their own right. Then they built the ships. By around 1200 BC, the yards on that coast were producing keeled merchant vessels using mortise and tenon joinery, a method of locking planks together so robust that it remained the Mediterranean standard until the Roman period. They rigged them with brailed sails, using lines that let a crew shape and furl the canvas in stages, which meant a ship could work against the wind instead of only running before it. A vessel that can beat upwind is not restricted to one sailing season and one direction. It can go where the cargo is. Everything else stacked on top of that. Glassmaking, learned from Egypt and pushed further into both transparent and opaque wares, turning out plates, drinking vessels, beads and jewelry by the shipload. Textiles woven from Egyptian linen and Persian silk. Ivory carving, metal bowls, elaborately worked, that turn up in graves 1,000 kilometers from where they were made. And an alphabet. 22 signs, no vowels, angular enough to cut quickly into soft material with a stylus. Set that against cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs, systems with hundreds of signs requiring years of training and a professional scribal class to maintain. This one could be learned in days. It was not built as a monument to anything. It was built so a merchant could keep his own accounts. So here's the balance sheet: a strip of coast with no farmland, no metal, no grain, and no army. A cluster of cities that never unified, never conquered one another, and never produced a king who ruled more than his own walls. And commercial control of an entire sea, from Lebanon to the Atlantic, held for the better part of 1,000 years. How does that happen? For 2,000 years, the answer has come bundled inside a name, and the name was not theirs. They never called themselves Phoenicians, not once, in anything that survives. The word is Greek, and its origin is most likely the Greek term for purple, which means that the name by which this civilization is known in every textbook on Earth is a Greek merchant's shorthand for the product they sold. Imagine a people remembered permanently as the dye sellers. The second name is worse. Punic, the word applied to the western settlements and to Carthage, is simply the Latin form of that same Greek word adopted by Rome. So the two labels that carry this entire civilization through history were both supplied by the two powers that fought it hardest and eventually destroyed it. What did they call themselves? Their cities. Men of Tyre, men of Sidon, men of Byblos. Identity was municipal, not national, and there is no surviving word in their own language for the collective thing that modern historians mean when they say Phoenician. That matters more than it sounds, because of what else is missing. They left almost nothing of their own. No surviving religious text, no native history, no chronicle, no royal annals, nothing comparable to what Egypt or Assyria carved into stone. Part of that is climate. They wrote on papyrus, and papyrus does not survive in a damp coastal environment the way it does in Egyptian sand. Part of it is Rome, which leveled Carthage in 146 BC and dispersed or destroyed its libraries. The result is that the portrait we have was painted entirely by other people. Homer, who calls them greedy in the same breath as praising their craftsmanship. Aristotle, analyzing Carthage as a constitutional specimen. The Hebrew Bible, describing their gods as idols. Roman historians, writing about an enemy their state had annihilated. Every characterization of this civilization comes from a rival, a competitor, or a conqueror. Now take the model that was built on top of that word, because it is held for 2 millennia and it is the thing this video is about. The model is colonization by mother city. A city on the Levantine coast, most often Tyre, sends out a party of settlers. They found a trading post somewhere west. The post governs itself, runs its own affairs, and sends a tribute payment home at intervals. The earliest of these appear on Cyprus and Crete, then spread slowly westward into Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearics, along the North African coast, into Iberia, and eventually past Gibraltar onto the Atlantic seaboard. Carthage is the one that outgrows the model. Founded from Tyre, traditionally in 814 BC, it becomes a metropolis and then builds an empire of its own, exercising hegemony over the other Western settlements until Rome removes it. Every element of that account is documented. The tribute payments, the foundation dates, the competition with Greek colonists over the same coastlines. None of it is invented. But notice what it takes for granted. That model requires people to have moved. It requires families from Tyre and Sidon getting into ships, sailing 2, 3, 4,000 kilometers, and founding daughter populations that were biologically continuous with the coast they left. That is what a colony means in the sense the word has always been used here. And that specific claim was never demonstrated. It was inferred. It was inferred because the language at both ends was the same, and the alphabet was the same, and the gods had the same names, and the burial practices matched, and the pottery styles traveled. Shared culture was being read as a receipt for shared ancestry. In the absence of any biological evidence at all, there was nothing else available to read it as, and the archaeology of those Western settlements had been quietly refusing to cooperate with that reading for a very long time. Start with the letters, because they are the oldest evidence, and they are extremely rude. Among the diplomatic correspondence recovered at Amarna in Egypt, there are letters from the rulers of the Levantine coastal cities to the Egyptian court. In one of them, the ruler of Byblos writes to complain that 2 of his trading vessels have been seized by the ruler of Beirut. He wants the pharaoh to do something about it. These are cities 40 kilometers apart, speaking the same language, worshipping in the same idiom, both under the same imperial overlord. And they are stealing each other's ships and reporting one another to Egypt. That is not internal correspondence within a people. That is competition between rivals who happen to share a coastline. It never resolved either. Across roughly 1,000 years, not one of these cities made a serious attempt to subject the others by force. There was never a unified Phoenician state, never a Phoenician king, never a capital. The usual explanation is manpower. A society of coastal trading cities with no agricultural hinterland simply could not raise the population to field a conquering army, which is also, eventually, why every one of them was absorbed by somebody who could. Now look at the settlements themselves, and the numbers stop matching the story. The colonies were small, rarely more than 1,000 inhabitants. Most exercised almost no territorial control beyond their own walls, which is why they cluster on headlands, islands, and river mouths rather than on farmland. They were autonomous almost immediately, running their own administration and their own affairs, with a tribute payment sent home at intervals and very little else. That is not what a settlement wave looks like. A migrating population takes land. These took harbors. Then there is the art, and this is the strangest piece of it. Phoenician artistic production is an amalgam. Egyptian headgear on one figure, the Assyrian motif of a lion standing on a mountain beside it, Cypriot forms, Aegean decorative schemes, often combined inside a single object. A carved stele from Amrit puts Egyptian and Assyrian elements on the same face. The ivories show Egyptian and Assyrian influence. The metal bowls carry geometric and floral designs alongside sphinxes and winged goddesses drawn from 3 separate traditions. Specialists have argued for over a century about whether a distinctively Phoenician style exists at all, or whether what we call Phoenician art is simply everyone else's art, executed superbly, by craftsmen who worked to whatever the customer wanted. The religion does the same thing. There are shared features across the cities, enough to speak of a Phoenician religion in general terms, but every city had its own chief deity and its own pantheon. Melkart supreme at Tyre, Baal at Gebal at Byblos. At Sidon, Baal at the head of the pantheon, but distant from daily worship, with Astarte far more present in the inscriptions, and the healing god Eshmun alongside her. Even the gods refused to standardize, and the politics kept moving. Early monarchy giving way over centuries to councils of elders and assemblies of citizens. By the 6th century, Tyre being governed by a pair of magistrates called Sophites rather than a king. When Alexander arrived outside the city in 332 BC, he was met by a council representing the Commonwealth. When he reached Sidon, a Roman historian records that the king surrendered at the urging of his people rather than by his own decision. Put all of that side by side, and a pattern surfaces that nobody has a comfortable name for. Every category we normally use to identify a people, the civilization fails. One state, no. One capital, no. One style, no. One pantheon, no. One government, no. It looks less like a nation that expanded, and more like something the ancient world has no other example of, which meant only one kind of evidence could settle it. And when that evidence first arrived, it appeared to confirm the traditional story completely. The first question genetics was pointed at was not the colonies, it was the homeland. Because there had always been a competing story about where the Phoenicians themselves came from, and it had impeccable ancient credentials. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, records that they originally came from the Erythraean Sea, migrating to the Mediterranean coast and settling in the land where they still lived in his own day, after which they immediately began making long voyages. Strabo, writing 4 centuries later, repeats it. Modern scholarship took that seriously enough to look for a source. The Dilmun civilization, which flourished in what is now Bahrain from the late 3rd into the 2nd millennium BC, was proposed as a possible origin. It has been pointed out since that the dates do not align well, and that during the early 3rd millennium, when this migration is supposed to have happened, there is no evidence of occupation at the relevant sites at all. So genetics was applied to the coast itself, and the answer came back clean. A study published in 2017 found that modern Lebanese populations derive the majority of their ancestry from Canaanite populations. That is continuity, not replacement. Whatever else happened on that coastline over 3,000 years, the people did not get swapped out. Then the ancient material. Whole genome analysis of 5 Bronze Age individuals from Sidon and 12 Iron Age individuals from Beirut showed that Phoenicians in the Levant were genetically similar to the local Bronze Age Canaanite population. And when the large 2025 study ran its own comparison, individuals from the Levantine Phoenician site of Axiv clustered together with previously published Bronze and Iron Age Levantine individuals, including from Megiddo and from Sidon and Beirut. The homeland question is closed, and the answer is unglamorous in the best possible way. The Phoenicians were Canaanites. They were not immigrants from the Persian Gulf. They were not a mystery population arriving from outside. They were the descendants of the people who had been farming and fishing that strip of coast for the previous 2,000 years. The inventors of the alphabet were locals, which appeared to settle everything else by inheritance. Follow the logic, because it is airtight until you look at the second link. The Phoenicians of the Levant are Canaanites. The Western settlements were founded by Phoenicians from the Levant. Therefore, the people in the Western settlements are Canaanites. Carthage, Motia, Cadiz, Abitha, the Sardinian ports, all of them daughter populations of a Levantine parent. Every step of that chain looked solid. The first step had now been demonstrated with genomes. The second step had 2,000 years of foundation dates, tribute records, shared gods, and shared script behind it. And the second step had never been tested. Every genetic study of the Phoenicians up to that point had sampled the homeland, Sidon, Beirut, Axiv, the coast. The Western sites, the ones that made the actual claim, had been examined only through mitochondrial DNA, recovered from a handful of individuals at a handful of locations. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited only down the female line. It traces one thread, mother to mother to mother, and it says nothing whatever about the other several dozen ancestors a person had 4 generations back. Those earlier studies did show diverse maternal lineages in Punic burials, which was noted at the time and largely set aside. With that resolution, it could not be pushed further. So the position, as of about 10 years ago, was this. The most confident claim in the entire field, repeated in every survey and every textbook, rested on an inference that no one had checked in the places where it actually made an assertion. In 2025, somebody checked. The work was led by Harold Ringbauer, who began it as a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard and is now a group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, working with Dalit Regev of the Israel Antiquities Authority and a large international team. The scale is what makes it decisive. Genome-wide data for 210 individuals. 196 of those came from 14 sites traditionally identified as Phoenician and Punic, spread across the Levant, North Africa, Iberia, Sicily, Sardinia, and Ibiza, plus 1 early Iron Age individual from Algeria. The results were published in Nature in April of 2025. The difference between this and everything before it is the phrase genome-wide. Mitochondrial DNA follows a single maternal line. It is one thread pulled out of a garment, and from one thread you can say something about the dye and almost nothing about the weave. Genome-wide data reads the entire cloth. It can tell you what proportions of a person's ancestry came from which populations, and it can identify shared segments between 2 individuals precisely enough to establish that they were related. Here is what came back. Levantine Phoenicians made little genetic contribution to Punic settlements in the central and western Mediterranean between the 6th and 2nd centuries BC, despite abundant archaeological evidence of cultural, historical, linguistic, and religious links. Read that again, because the word doing the work is little, not reduced, not diluted, little. The individuals from the western sites do not cluster with the Levantine individuals at all. Instead, they are broadly distributed, with their primary concentration overlapping Bronze and Iron Age individuals from Sicily and the Aegean, and this holds regardless of which site they were dug out of. Ibiza, Sardinia, Sicily, Iberia, North Africa. Same answer. The second component is North African, and it grows over time, tracking the rise of Carthage as the political center of the Western Phoenician world. But it is a minority contributor at every single sampled site, including Carthage itself. So the capital of the Punic world was not majority Levantine, and it was not majority North African either. Ringbauer's own description of the finding is that they found surprisingly little direct genetic contribution from Levantine Phoenicians to Western and Central Mediterranean Punic populations, and that this provides a new perspective on how Phoenician culture spread. Not through large-scale mass migration, he says, but through a dynamic process of cultural transmission and assimilation. Now translate that into people. The population of Carthage spoke a Levantine Semitic language. They wrote it in the Levantine alphabet. They worshipped Canaanite gods under Canaanite names, buried their dead according to Canaanite practice, ran a Levantine style of city government, and fought 3 enormous wars against Rome under Levantine personal names. Hannibal is a Canaanite name. It means the grace of Baal. And in ancestry, they were not from there. 3 limits need stating, because the study states them and the finding is strong enough that it does not need help. The analysis could not confidently pin down the precise geographical origin of that Sicilian and Aegean ancestry component. It identifies the profile, not the village. The paper uses the word Punic deliberately as a label for a group of sites and their inhabitants, not as a claim about a nation or an ethnicity. And none of this says that nobody ever sailed west from Tyre. It says that whoever did, their descendants are not the bulk of the people buried in these cemeteries, which leaves a question considerably harder than the one everybody had been asking. If the people in a Phoenician city did not come from Phoenicia, then where did a Phoenician city get its Phoenicians? The answer starts with 2 skeletons that should not be related. Buried into the study's data is a detection of shared genetic segments between individuals at distant sites. One of those pairs is a set of probable second cousins. One of them was buried at a Punic site in North Africa. The other was buried in Sicily. Second cousins share a great-grandparent. That is not deep ancestry, it is a family. Somebody in living memory had grandchildren who ended up on 2 different continents, separated by open sea, and both of them died inside the same cultural world. Consider what a single pair like that requires to exist. It does not require a migration. Migrations are one-directional and they happen once. What it requires is traffic. Continuous, routine, multi-generational movement of individuals and families across the entire basin, dense enough and normal enough that cousins ending up on opposite shores is unremarkable rather than extraordinary. Ringbauer's term for the mechanism is a Mediterranean highway, maintained by the trade running between the outposts. Now look at what the sites themselves contain. Punic settlements were home to people with radically different ancestry profiles, living alongside one another. At Carthage, individuals whose ancestry traces to indigenous North African populations were buried in the same city as people of Sicilian and Aegean descent. Different Punic sites right across the central and western Mediterranean show the same pattern of high genetic diversity in every region and in every period sampled. These were not colonies in the sense the word has always been used. They were ports where everyone arrived. Which brings the whole thing into focus, and the reframe is the point of this video. Phoenician was not a bloodline. It was a package, a language, an alphabet, a set of gods, a legal and commercial practice, a way of building and rigging a ship. And the package was portable in a way that ancestry is not. You did not have to be born into it. You had to adopt it. Go back now and collect every anomaly from earlier, because each one of them resolves here. No unified state, because there was never a single people to unify. No distinctive artistic style, because the style was whatever the local craftsman already made, with the network's motifs laid over the top. A different chief god in every city, because every city brought its own and kept it. Colonies of 1,000 people that never took farmland, because a franchise does not need settlers, it needs participants. Even the competition makes sense. Byblos seizing the ships of Beirut is not a civil war. It is 2 firms in the same trade. And the alphabet stops being a footnote about the origins of writing and becomes the central exhibit. 22 signs, no vowels, learnable in days, with no scribal class required to maintain it. Deliberately simple, deliberately easy to adapt to whatever language the user already spoke. That is not the writing system of a people guarding an inheritance. Cuneiform and hieroglyphs were guarded inheritances, and they died with the institutions that maintained them. This one was designed to be handed to a stranger, an organization that recruits builds tools that outsiders can pick up. That alphabet is now, in one derived form or another, the writing system of most of the planet, and it spread for exactly the reason the culture spread: one honest limit, held to the end. This explains how the culture propagated. It does not explain why the Sicilian and Aegean component dominates rather than some other, and the study says so directly. That question is open. But notice what the finding makes these people historically. Not a race that expanded, not a nation that colonized, something considerably rarer, and until now, unrecognized. Go back to the graves on the Tunisian coast, a city that Rome pulled down to the foundations in 146 BC, holding people who wrote a Levantine alphabet, prayed to Canaanite gods, carried names that meant the grace of Baal, and were born from somewhere else entirely. For 2,000 years, these people were described using a word supplied by their enemies, and the word smuggled in an assumption nobody thought to examine: that a civilization is something you inherit. Every search for the Phoenicians as a race, a migration, a bloodline moving west along the sea lanes, was looking for a thing that was never there to find. The question was never what happened to the Phoenicians. It was why we ever assumed a civilization had to be something you are born into, rather than something you can join.